There is a moment after you bury someone that nobody warns you about. Not the crying, not the black clothes, not the handshakes from people who smell like old coffee and say he's in a better place now, like they have GPS coordinates to confirm it. The moment nobody warns you about is the silence after. When the last car pulls away, when the folding chairs get stacked, when the flowers are still fresh, but everything else has already started dying. When you turn your back on that mound of dark earth and take your first step toward whatever life looks like now. That step, that one small, ordinary step away from a grave. That is where this story begins. Because sometimes God, or fate, or the universe, or whatever you believe moves things around when you're not looking. Sometimes it waits for exactly that moment. The lowest one, the emptiest one, the one where a person has nothing left and doesn't even know what they would do with something if they had it. And then it moves. This is the true story of what happened to one family the day they buried their own. What they found when they turned around. What changed in a single afternoon that rewrote the next 20 years of their lives. You won't see the ending coming. Neither did they. The grave was fresh. So fresh that the soil on top of it still held the shape of the shovel's edge, clean and geometric against the soft brown earth, like someone had taken the time to be artistic about grief. Ruth Calloway stood at the edge of it and thought about that. She thought about the edges of things. How some things had clean edges and some things had none at all, just blur and more blur, and you kept reaching for a boundary that wasn't there. Her brother was in the ground. James, 51 years old. Big hands, always smelled like engine grease even after a shower, laughed too loud in restaurants. James, who used to call her every Sunday at 11 in the morning because their mother had made them both promise to do that, back when their mother was still alive to extract such promises. James, who had kept calling even after the promise expired because he said Sunday mornings were boring and Ruth was funnier than television. He had not called last Sunday. He would not call this Sunday. Ruth was 47. She had driven 14 hours from Spokane to a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio, with a duffel bag and a box of tissues she'd bought at a gas station somewhere in Idaho. She had cried through Montana, gone dry and blank somewhere in Wyoming, come back a little in Nebraska, which surprised her because Nebraska did not seem like a place designed to crack anything open. Now she stood here with her shoes sinking slightly into the soft ground near the grave, and she felt nothing. Not peace, not grief, nothing. Just the particular flatness of a person who's been feeling things so hard for so many days that the machinery finally ceased. James's wife, Carol, stood to Ruth's left. Small woman. Silver hair she kept short, because James had always said it made her look like a French actress, and Carol had believed him even though he had never in his life seen a French film. Carol had not cried during the service. She had stood very straight and held her daughter's hand and looked at the casket like she was memorizing it, like she needed to know what it looked like so she could describe it later to someone who hadn't been there. Their daughter, Maya, was 23. She stood on the other side of Carol. Maya had her father's hands, wide palms, blunt fingers, and she kept looking at those hands during the service. Ruth had noticed turning them over and back, like she was trying to find where her father had gone inside them. The pastor finished. People moved. That slow, shuffling exodus that happens at the end of graveside services. Everyone suddenly very interested in getting back to their cars, back to casseroles and warm houses, back to the particular comfort of being around the living. Ruth watched them go. Old men who had worked with James at the shop. Neighbors who had lived next door for 20 years and would return to their houses and eat dinner and turn on the television and continue their lives, as they should, as everyone must. She did not move. Carol touched her arm. We should go back to the house. People will come. I know, Ruth said. Give me a minute. Carol nodded and walked away with Maya, and Ruth stood there alone at the grave, and the cemetery went quiet the way cemeteries go quiet when everyone finally stops pretending that noise helps. She looked at the soil. The flowers on top, white chrysanthemums because James had once said they were his favorite, which Ruth was fairly certain was not true. She was fairly certain he had said that to seem agreeable during some long-ago conversation about flowers. But here they were, white chrysanthemums on James's grave, because he had been agreeable about flowers, and now Carol would carry that forever. Ruth said something to him, not out loud, just in the place where you talk to people who can't talk back anymore. She said something that she would never repeat to anyone because it was only for him, and then she turned around. She took that step, the first one, away from the grave, and she almost walked directly into a boy. He was maybe 9 years old, standing maybe 4 feet behind her, which meant he had been standing there for some portion of her private moment, which was the kind of thing that would have embarrassed her on any other day. Today she just looked at him. He was thin, wearing clothes that were slightly too big, a gray shirt with a logo on it that had mostly cracked and peeled away so you could only tell it had once been a logo. His hair needed cutting. He was holding, Ruth blinked, a single white flower. Not a chrysanthemum. Something small and yellow and wild-looking, the kind of thing that grows at the edge of pavement where nobody planted it. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the grave. Sorry, Ruth said, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. The boy looked up at her. He had very dark eyes. Serious eyes. The kind of eyes that you see sometimes in children who have had to think too much too early. Eyes that have done work that eyes that age shouldn't have to do. Was he yours? The boy said. Ruth didn't know exactly why that phrasing, so blunt and precise, opened something in her chest. My brother, she said. The boy nodded slowly, like he was filing that away. I'm sorry, he said, and it came out like he meant it. Not the automatic version, not the handshake and coffee smell version. He meant it the way people mean it when they know what loss actually feels like in the body. Ruth looked around the cemetery. Not a single person was nearby. Are you here with someone? She said. My grandma, he said. He pointed vaguely to the left, toward an older section of the cemetery, the part with the weathered gray headstones that had started sinking sideways into the earth over decades. She's over there. She comes here a lot. To see someone? My grandpa, he said. But she doesn't come to see him, really. She just comes to sit. He paused. She says the cemetery is the quietest place in town. Ruth almost laughed. She didn't, but almost. She's not wrong, she said. The boy held out the yellow flower. Just held out toward her. Not saying anything. Not explaining the gesture. Ruth took it. She didn't know why. She just took it, and it sat in her hand, this small yellow thing, and she looked at it, and the boy said, it's from the field on the other side of the fence. I pick one every time I come. I was going to put it on my grandpa's grave, but I thought maybe your person needed it more, because yours just happened. Ruth stood very still. 47 years old, dry-eyed through 3 states, dry-eyed through the service, dry-eyed through the pastor, and the handshakes and the casseroles being promised. She cried, right there, in front of this stranger child who had handed her a weed from beside a fence. Ruth Calloway broke completely open, and the boy didn't step back or look uncomfortable. He just stood there and let her do it the way some people, rare people, people of a specific and strange decency, know how to stand in the presence of someone else's pain without trying to fix it or flee it. After a while, she stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Thank you, she said. Sure, he said. Then what was he like? And Ruth, who had not been able to find a single word during the service when the pastor asked if anyone wanted to share, Ruth opened her mouth. She talked for 20 minutes. She told this boy, whose name she still did not know, about James, about the Sunday calls, about the engine grease, about how he had once driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to help her jumpstart her car, not because she'd asked him to, but because she'd mentioned in passing that her battery was being weird, and he'd shown up 2 days later with jumper cables and a look on his face like it was a perfectly normal thing to do. About how he made the worst coffee she had ever tasted in her life, but offered it with such sincerity that she drank it every single time. About how he could not remember anyone's birthday, but always sent a card anyway, late with a note that said, I know, don't start like they'd already been arguing. The boy listened. He asked 2 questions. Both of them were good questions. When she finished, he nodded. He sounds like the kind of person who shows up, he said. Ruth felt that land in her like something thrown from a distance finally arriving. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, that's exactly what he was." The boy looked back toward the old section of the cemetery. "I should get back to my grandma," he said. "Of course." Ruth hesitated. "What's your name?" "Daniel," he said. "I'm Ruth." He nodded, serious, like they had concluded a formal arrangement. Then he turned and walked away across the grass, and Ruth watched him go, this thin boy in the too-big shirt with the peeled-away logo, walking between the headstones with the ease of someone who had been here many times. She stood there holding the yellow flower. She did not know yet, could not have known, that this was not a random encounter. That this boy, Daniel, lived 3 blocks from her brother's house. That his grandmother, the woman who came to sit in cemeteries for the quiet, was a woman named Agnes. That Agnes, in the weeks and months that followed, would become something to Carol and Maya and Ruth that none of them had language for yet. She did not know that Daniel was the reason any of it started. She did not know anything yet except that a 9-year-old boy had handed her a weed and let her talk about her brother, and something in her that had been locked and silent for days had come loose. Ruth turned back to look at the grave one more time. The white chrysanthemums, the fresh soil with its clean shovel edges, the geometric grief. She placed the yellow flower on top of the white ones. Then she walked back toward the cars, toward Carol's house, toward the casseroles, and the people, and the rest of this day that had to be gotten through. She did not know that when she got to the house, there would be a piece of paper waiting. Not a letter, not a document, just a piece of paper, handwritten, tucked under the front door by someone who had clearly come and gone before the service ended, before anyone returned, a piece of paper that would change what happened next in a way that no one in that family, not Ruth, not Carol, not Maya, not James's old co-workers or his neighbors with their casseroles, could have predicted or prepared for. The door to Carol's house was unlocked, as it always was, as James had always said it should be, because locks were for people who had things worth stealing, and he was not that kind of man. Ruth pushed it open, and there on the doormat was the paper. Carol picked it up before Ruth could, unfolded it, read it once, standing in the doorway with the afternoon light coming in around her. The color left Carol's face. Not grief, not sadness, something else entirely. Something that looked, against all reason, after all of this, like the beginning of something. Maya said, "Mom, what is it?" Carol looked up. She looked at Ruth. She looked at Maya. "It's from James," she said. The house went so quiet that Ruth could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, faithful and indifferent, keeping things cold. The paper was 3 paragraphs long. James Calloway had never been a man who wrote things down. He texted in fragments, called instead of emailed, left voicemails that ran long, and circled back and repeated themselves because he was thinking out loud, always thinking out loud, the words and the thought arriving at the same time with no editing between them. He was not a man who drafted things. He was not a man who revised. But this letter was careful. Carol read it aloud. Her voice stayed level for the first paragraph and cracked on one word in the second. Not the word you would expect, not a word with obvious emotional weight, just the word Thursday, which was the day James had apparently sat down to write this alone in the house. Carol at work, Maya in Columbus. And then her voice came back and finished. The letter said 3 things. It said that James had known for 8 months. The diagnosis, the prognosis, the particular mathematics of how many Sundays a man with his specific cancer could reasonably expect to have. He had not told Carol because he had spent the first month being angry and the second month being terrified and the third month trying to figure out how to say it. And then the 4th month came and he thought maybe he would just fix things instead of saying anything, which he understood was not healthy, but was also entirely who he was. It said that he'd spent those months fixing things. And it said where to look. Carol lowered the paper. She stood there in her own doorway while people were pulling into the driveway behind her, neighbors arriving with foil-covered dishes, and she held the paper against her chest and looked at Ruth with an expression Ruth had never seen on her sister-in-law's face in 22 years of knowing her. It was the expression of a person who has just been caught mid-fall by something they did not know was there. "Maya said, Mom, tell me." So Carol told her. James had known he was dying and had not said so, which was complicated, which was a thing that would take months and probably years to feel all the feelings about, because it was both an act of profound love and an act of profound control. And those two things lived right next to each other in this particular story and would not be neatly separated. Ruth knew that. She could see Maya knowing it too, the girl's wide hands going still at her sides, working through the arithmetic of it. Dad knew. Dad didn't tell us. Dad spent 8 months quietly doing things. And now Dad is in the ground, and the things are done, and we are standing here. But that was not the part that changed everything. The part that changed everything was what James had fixed. He had gone back to the house he grew up in. That house, the one on Demarest Street, the one where Ruth and James had grown up after their parents moved the family from Georgia in 1983, the one with the green shutters and the porch that sagged in the middle like a hammock, had sat empty for 11 years since their mother died. It was technically owned by both Ruth and James, inherited jointly, never sold, never properly dealt with, because dealing with it meant deciding what to do with the particular weight of everything that had happened inside it. They had simply not dealt with it. They had paid the minimal property taxes and not spoken about it much, and let the grass grow long in summers and not spoken about it some more. James had gone back. He had spent the better part of 6 months working on that house. His letter did not say this in those words. He said, "I took care of the place on Demarest," in the particular James way of understatement. But what they would discover in the following days was the full scope of what taking care of had meant. New roof. The porch reinforced. The sagging middle of it lifted and re-leveled and made solid. The interior repainted in the original colors, which he had apparently tracked down by calling the city records office and asking about permits from the 1980s. New water heater. Electrical panel brought up to code. The garden in the back, which their mother had kept with a religiosity that bordered on liturgical, replanted. Not the same plants, because James didn't know the names of the original plants, but he had apparently taken a photograph of an old home video. Ruth found out later he had sat alone watching their childhood home videos for a full afternoon and taken photos of the screen with his phone, and brought the photograph to a garden center and said, "I need whatever these are." The garden center had figured it out. Zinnias. Their mother's zinnias, orange and red and yellow, replanted along the back fence exactly as they had been, as close as a man with a photograph and a dying heart and a determination to do this one last thing could manage. James had also done one more thing that the letter directed them to find, not described in words, but located with instructions. Go to the house, go to the back bedroom, look in the closet on the top shelf. Carol drove. Ruth sat in the passenger seat. Maya sat in the back, and the three of them drove in silence through this small Ohio town while on the other side of town, at Carol's house, well-meaning neighbors arranged casseroles on a kitchen counter and wondered where the family had gone. The house on Demarest Street looked. Ruth lost language for a moment when they turned onto the block. She had not been here in 9 years. The last time had been for a reason she didn't want to think about, a different kind of hard thing, and she had stood on that sagging porch and not gone inside and driven away. The porch was not sagging anymore. The green shutters were fresh, not the faded, peeling olive gray they had become over the 11 years of neglect, but the actual green from her childhood. Not approximate, the actual color, the precise, specific green that lived in the part of her memory where home lived. James had matched it exactly. Ruth did not know how he had matched it exactly. She would find out later that he had made 4 trips to the paint store with paint chips and kept saying not quite until they mixed the right one. She sat in the passenger seat and did not get out of the car. Carol did. Maya did. They walked up to the front door, and Carol used the key that the letter had said would be under the 3rd porch board from the left. James had always been theatrical about key hiding. It was one of his things, and the door opened. Ruth got out of the car. She walked up the newly solid porch steps and through the door. The smell hit her first. Paint, yes, fresh paint, but underneath it's something that made no sense, something that should not have been chemically possible with a new paint job and 11 years of empty house. It smelled faintly, impossibly like her mother's cooking, like the particular combination of coffee and whatever her mother had always burned slightly on Sunday mornings. She stood in the front hallway and could not move for a moment and did not try to explain it because some things, as James had apparently understood, do not need explaining. The interior was repainted in the exact colors. The living room's particular shade of warm yellow. The hallway's pale green that was almost white, but not quite. The kitchen's cream and red. Ruth walked through the rooms and felt 11 years, and then deeper, felt 30 years, felt 40 years, felt the specific sensation of being inside a place that existed simultaneously in your past and your present, the walls the same walls, the light falling at the same angle through windows that still face the same direction. She walked to the back bedroom, their mother's room, or it had been. Now it was just a room, empty, smelling of new paint, with the afternoon light coming through curtains that were white and plain and new. Ruth went to the closet. She opened it. She looked up at the top shelf. There was a box, an old shoebox, the kind that had once held work boots, the cardboard worn soft with age. James had written on the top in his heavy, slightly crooked handwriting, "Asterisk for both of you. Yes, both. Don't argue." Asterisk. Ruth took it down. She sat on the floor of the empty room with her back against the wall and opened it. Inside were letters. Not new ones. Old ones, decades old. The envelopes yellowed. The handwriting on some of them faded to gray. Letters their mother had written and never sent. Letters to James and Ruth at various ages, written during various periods of their lives. The postmarks never applied because these were the things their mother had needed to say, but had not found the way to say out loud. Ruth did not know these letters existed. James must have found them somewhere in the house during one of his visits and kept them. And now here they were. Under the letters were photographs. Not copies, originals. Family photographs from the 70s and 80s from Georgia before the move, from this house in the early years. Photographs Ruth had thought were lost when her mother's house was cleared after she died. Someone had apparently saved them. James had apparently found them. James had apparently put them here. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of blue cloth, was their mother's recipe book. Ruth held it for a long time. The recipe book was spiral-bound, the cover water-stained, the pages so used that some of them had separated from the binding and been tucked back and loose. It smelled of something Ruth could not name, but recognized in the same wordless way she had recognized the smell when she walked through the front door. Their mother had written notes in the margins, little comments to no one in particular. "More garlic than this says," and "James hates this," and "make this for Ruthie's birthday," and dates that had no explanation, just dates, the way people marked things that mattered. Carol appeared in the doorway. She had been in the kitchen. She looked at Ruth on the floor with the box and the recipe book and said nothing. Maya appeared behind Carol. She looked at her aunt and then at the box, and then she came and sat down on the floor beside Ruth, uninvited and natural, the way family is supposed to work when it is working, and she looked at the recipe book in Ruth's hands. "What is that?" Maya said. "Your grandmother's," Ruth said. Maya was quiet. Then, "Did you know she wrote in the margins?" "Yeah," Ruth said. Maya reached out and turned a page. Her wide hands, her father's hands, turning her grandmother's pages. She read a margin note. Her face did something complicated. The three of them sat on the floor of that empty room in that repaired house, while outside the window of the garden held its impossible zinnias, orange and red and yellow in the afternoon light, and the weight of what James had done settled over them slowly, the way things settle when they are true and large and take up the real amount of space they occupy. He had not told them he was dying. He had spent 8 months turning the facts of his dying into something they could stand inside of after he was gone. He had fixed the porch so it wouldn't sag. He had found the colors. He had replanted the flowers. He had put their mother's letters and their mother's photographs and their mother's recipe book in a shoebox on a shelf and written "for both of you" on the top in his crooked handwriting. He had built them a place to come back to. Ruth thought about Daniel, the boy in the cemetery, with his serious eyes and his single yellow flower. He sounds like the kind of person who shows up. Yes, she thought. Even from wherever you go when you leave. Even from there, he showed up. Ruth stayed for 3 weeks. She had planned to stay for 5 days. She had a job in Spokane, an apartment with a lease, a life with its own ongoing demands, and its own calendar of things that needed doing. She had planned to do the things a sister does after a funeral. Help sort paperwork, sit with the widow, be present, and then drive back from Nebraska and Wyoming and Montana and return to her ordinary existence. She stayed for 3 weeks. It happened the way these things happen, not with a decision, but with a series of small failures to leave. There was always one more thing. One more afternoon in that kitchen with Carol, the recipe book open on the counter, both of them trying to decode their mother's handwriting on a margin note that said third step is wrong. Do it this way without specifying what the third step was or what this way meant. One more evening with Maya, who had taken leave from her job in Columbus and come back to her childhood home and was sleeping in her old room and wandering the house at night like someone working out the floor plan of a new country she'd been assigned to without a map. And then there was Agnes. Agnes came on the 4th day. Ruth answered the door because Carol was on the phone with the insurance company, navigating the particular bureaucratic landscape of death, forms and account transfers, and the long, grinding administration of loss. And Ruth opened the door, and there was a small woman with white hair, cropped close to her head, wearing a blue cardigan, holding a covered dish. "You must be the sister," Agnes said. "Ruth," Ruth said. Agnes handed her the dish. "It's soup. I don't do casseroles. Everyone does casseroles, and nobody needs more casserole. What a person needs after a loss is soup, something warm that doesn't require effort to eat." She said this with the authority of someone who has thought it through over many years and arrived at a firm conclusion. "I live on the next block. I knew James. He fixed my fence last summer. Never let me pay him." Ruth stood in the doorway. "Would you like to come in?" "No," Agnes said. "I just came to bring the soup, but I'll come back Thursday, if that's all right." "That's all right," Ruth said. Agnes came back Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She was 74 years old, had lived in this neighborhood for 41 years, had buried a husband and a son, and had developed through the weight of that particular curriculum the specific and unself-conscious ability to sit with grieving people without filling the silence. She came and she sat and she drank coffee black, no sugar, and she talked sometimes and didn't talk sometimes, and she never once said he's in a better place, or at least he didn't suffer, or any of the other things people say when they cannot tolerate the reality of what has happened to the people in front of them. Ruth recognized her. Not Agnes herself. Ruth had never met her. But the quality in her. The same quality she had felt from Daniel in the cemetery. That particular and rare decency of someone who can stand in someone else's pain without trying to redirect it. She mentioned Daniel one afternoon. "Your grandson," she said. "He was at the cemetery." Agnes looked up from her coffee. "I know. He told me." A pause. "He said he gave a flower to the woman at the new grave." "He did," Ruth said. "It helped." Agnes considered this. "He's a good boy," she said in the same flat, certain way she'd said the thing about casseroles. Not a proud grandmother's softness. Just a fact stated by someone who has evaluated a person and reached a conclusion. He sees things. Always has since he was small. Some children are like that. How old was he when his grandfather died? 5, Agnes said. Ruth absorbed that. 5 years old, sitting with his grandmother in a cemetery, learning how to be present in places most people avoided. Learning, apparently, that you could pick a flower from beside a fence and give it to a stranger, and that this was a worthwhile thing to do with an afternoon. She thought about the ways people pass things down. Not just recipes and margin notes, not just houses repainted in specific colors, but this too, the quality of how to be in the world. Daniel had learned it here, in these Saturday mornings in the cemetery while his grandmother sat with her dead husband's headstone and found the quiet that the town couldn't offer anywhere else. He had learned how to be still in the presence of grief because Agnes had been still in the presence of grief, and he had been there to see it. James had called her every Sunday at 11 because their mother had made them promise. Their mother had written recipe notes in the margins for reasons that had no audience, just the private act of talking to the page. Agnes had brought soup instead of casserole because she had learned something about what people actually need. All of it was inheritance, just not the kind that comes with lawyers. On the second Thursday, Daniel came with Agnes. He sat at the kitchen table while the women talked, and he did his homework with the focused seriousness of a child who takes homework seriously. And at one point he looked up and said to Ruth, "Did you find what was in the house?" Everyone stopped. Ruth looked at him. "What do you know about the house?" "James showed me," Daniel said simply. "Last summer, when he was fixing the porch. I used to walk by, and he'd be out there working, and one day he asked if I wanted to see what he was doing, and I said yes." He went back to his homework. He showed me the garden, too. He said the flowers were his mom's favorite. Carol had gone, still across the table. "He talked to you," Carol said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yeah," Daniel said. "A lot. He talked a lot." He said it without any implication, just confirming a fact about a man's nature. Carol pressed her lips together, nodded, looked at the window. Ruth thought about James talking to this 9-year-old boy during those long months of fixing the house, the months when he was keeping the secret from everyone who loved him. James, unable to say what was happening to his family, had apparently said some of it to a child who walked by and said yes when asked if he wanted to see what was being done to a porch. The specific loneliness of that, and the specific rightness of it too. James being James, finding connection in the available form, talking to the person who showed up the way he always had. "Did he tell you he was sick?" Ruth said. Daniel looked up again, looked at her with those serious, work-done eyes. "No," he said, "but I knew." The kitchen held that. "Ow," Maya said from the other side of the table. Daniel thought about it. "The way he worked," he said, like he was trying to get things done before something. He paused. I didn't know what the something was, but you can tell when a person is working against the clock. He went back to his homework. Ruth looked at Carol. Carol looked at Ruth. This child, this 9-year-old boy who came to the cemetery for quiet and picked flowers from fence lines and could feel a dying man's urgency in the way he swung a hammer, who had apparently kept company with James during the 6-month project of repairing a house, not understanding the full shape of it, but understanding enough, the way children sometimes understand more than the words they have available. 3 weeks after the funeral, Ruth drove to the house on Demarest Street alone. She did this in the morning, before Carol was awake, before anyone expected her anywhere. She drove there and sat outside in the car for a while, looking at the porch, the green shutters, the particular honest plainness of a fixed-up house that has been fixed up out of love and not vanity. Then, she went inside with the key she'd had made. She walked through the rooms again, the yellow living room, the pale green hallway, the kitchen that smelled of fresh paint and something older underneath. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. She had been calling a real estate agent in Spokane once a week for the past 8 months, asking about rental prices in her building, trying to figure out whether she could afford to move somewhere larger, somewhere with a second room she could use as a studio space because she'd been painting again, badly and joyfully, and in the way you paint when you're not trying to be good at it, but just need a place to put things. She stood in the kitchen of the house on Demarest Street and looked at the window over the sink. It faced the backyard. The zinnias were out there, orange and red and yellow, catching the morning light. She thought about what it would cost to finish her lease in Spokane. She thought about 14 hours of driving through Montana and Wyoming and Nebraska and how she had gone dry and come back in Nebraska and how that was strange and how she had never spent enough time thinking about Nebraska. She thought about Carol 3 blocks away in a house that was suddenly too quiet. She thought about Maya, sleeping in her childhood room, wandering the floor plan of the new country she'd been assigned. She thought about Agnes, who brought soup instead of casserole, and knew the difference. She thought about Daniel, who could feel a dying man's urgency in the way he swung a hammer. She thought about James, who had spent his last 8 months building a place for people to come back to. She opened her phone and called the real estate agent in Spokane. "I need to talk about the lease," she said. She did not move into the house on Demarest Street immediately. Life does not move that cleanly. There were logistics, there were finances, there were complications of the kind that real life generates without permission and without narrative convenience. There were hard conversations with Carol about whether it was too much too close, whether Ruth was doing this for herself or for them, and whether the answer to that question even mattered, whether a thing could be for everyone at once and be no less real for it. There were months of that. But 14 months after the funeral, Ruth Calloway moved into the house on Demarest Street. She painted one room for sleeping and left the rest of it open, large, floored with afternoon light from the west-facing windows. She bought a table she could work at. She brought nothing from Spokane that she didn't love, which left her with less than she expected and more than enough. Carol was 3 blocks away. They had dinner together on Sundays. Not because anyone made a promise, though maybe the fact that their mother had once required this of James, and James had called Ruth every Sunday at 11 for 20 years, was itself a kind of inheritance that had moved through them and settled here. Maybe. They didn't talk about it in those terms. They just had dinner on Sundays, and sometimes Maya came, and sometimes Agnes came, and once Daniel came and ate everything on his plate, and then said to Ruth very seriously, "This is good. Is this from the book?" He meant the recipe book. He had seen her cooking from it one afternoon through the back window. "Yes," Ruth said. He nodded. "I thought so," he said. "It tastes like something old." She didn't know exactly what he meant by that. She thought maybe it meant the thing she wanted it to mean. That some foods carry history in them, that you can taste the margin notes and the Sundays and the person who wrote "Make this for Ruthie's birthday" in handwriting that had been alive once, and was now preserving grease-stained paper in a spiral-bound book that smelled of decades. Or maybe he just meant it tasted good. Either way, the zinnias came back the second summer. Ruth had not been sure they would. She didn't know much about zinnias, had never gardened, had spent the first spring in the house watching the back garden with a combination of hope and skepticism, watering things based on guesswork, and reading internet articles at 10 p.m. They came back anyway. Orange and red and yellow, the same colors along the same fence on the schedule of their own returning. She took a photograph of them and sent it to Maya. Maya called her 10 minutes later and said, "Dad would love this." "I know," Ruth said. "He did love it," Maya said, correcting herself. "He did. Yes, he did. He had stood here in this yard, dying and not saying so, planting these specific flowers from a photograph taken from a home video, and he had loved this, had loved the fact that the colors were right, that the thing he was building would outlast the building of it, and become simply the garden, the house, the place, the ongoing fact of it. Ruth stood at the kitchen window and looked at the zinnias and thought about the step. The first one, away from the grave. The step nobody warns you about, the one that begins whatever comes after. She had taken it without knowing where it led. James had known where it led. Or he had trusted anyway, which is maybe the same thing. Not knowing the outcome, but building toward it with everything you have, the porch and the paint colors and the recipe book and the letters, the whole quiet structure of it, constructed while no one was watching, offered without explanation, trusting the people he loved to find it and to know. He showed up. He had always showed up. He was still doing it in the orange and red and yellow of late summer along a back fence in Ohio, in a recipe that tasted like something old, in a house that was the right shade of green, in the particular weight of a boy's serious eyes, and a single yellow flower placed on top of white chrysanthemums on a fresh grave on the worst afternoon of a family's life. Some people love you after they're gone. They figure out how. That's the story.